I'm Jack Zinda, Assistant Professor of Global Development at Cornell. And after postponing last spring, I'm delighted that we have Dr. Emily Ye together with us. Our co-sponsors for this talk are the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the Department of Global Development, Environment and Society major, and the Polson Institute for Global Development, and we thank them all for our support. In just a moment, I'm going to share a link in the chat window with other upcoming events hosted by the East Asia program. I'd like to remind you all that this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the East Asia program website, and a link will be sent out to all who registered to attend. After Dr. Ye's talk, we will have a Q&A using the Q&A function in Zoom. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Emily Ye. She's a professor of geography at the University of Colorado Boulder, and also the vice president of the American Association of Geographers. She has written or co-written many articles on environmental politics and development on the Tibetan Plateau. And her book, Taming Tibet, published with Cornell University Press, her book is titled Taming Tibet, Landscape Transformation and the Gift of Chinese Development. It examines state projects of development in Tibet from the Chinese takeover to the new millennium and won the E. Jean Smith Book Prize on Inner Asia, Association for Asian in the Association for Asian Studies, and it was also named a Best International Relations Book of 2014 by Foreign Affairs. She'll be speaking today on natural infrastructure in China's era of ecological civilization. And with that, Emily, I cede the floor to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I would like to start by thanking Jack, or John, as I still think of him, Zinda, as well as Amala Lane of the East Asia program at Cornell for inviting me to give this talk and making all of the arrangements. As Jack said, I was supposed to actually come in the spring, and I was going to give an entirely different talk about Tibetan environmentalists, and I see a few of you in the audience who know more of my Tibet work. So this is, something quite different from that. And I see Juliet Liu is here, and Juliet, I apologize, but you've heard this talk before. Anyway, so thank you for showing up. I know it's a really busy time, and people have a lot of priorities pulling them in different directions. This talk is really still a work in progress, and so I really welcome your comments, your suggestions, and your inputs. And what it is an attempt to think about how nature is being made into a kind of infrastructure in the context of China's ecological civilization building campaign. And so I'm going to start by discussing in more general terms what it might mean to think about nature as infrastructure, what tools are used to make nature infrastructural, and the role that natural infrastructure plays in ecological civilization. And then in the latter part of the talk, I'm going to zoom into a couple of very localized studies of scenic areas, which serve as examples of both infrastructural destruction and production in post-earthquake Sichuan province. The paper is motivated by being part of a China-made project at CU Boulder's Center for Asian Studies. And so this is kind of a loose collaborative project where a number of us are trying to explore the domestic and international dimensions of China's infrastructure development, with this idea that there's been a kind of infrastructural turn in the social sciences where a lot of people are thinking about infrastructure, but that has been quite disconnected from the China literature. A couple of other things I want to say before I start. First, I had presented Jack with a couple of different options for talks, and he chose this one, not knowing what I was going to say, but a lot of this work actually draws on collaborative work I've done earlier with him, particularly a co-authored article in Geoforum and a 2016 letter in Science, on which he was the lead author. And there's some other Cornell connections as well, where I'm finding that my work kind of overlaps a little bit with Jesse Rodenbiker's work as well. And he's, of course, a postdoc there. Second, I want to offer a little caveat that I think the initial poster that went out didn't very accurately maybe represent my take on ecological civilization. So I just want to clarify up front that I have a pretty critical view of ecological civilization. I'm not a cheerleader for the concept. So, if you were hoping to hear that analytical viewpoint, I apologize for disappointing you. And then I just want to say I've done a couple of these webinars, but it's really weird to not see my audience. So please bear with me as I kind of work my way through that. All right, so why think about infrastructure at all? China's incredible pace and scale of infrastructure building, both within its borders and globally with the Belt and Road Initiative, have attracted, again, a lot of media attention, of course, and a lot of scholarly attention. But as I alluded to earlier, it hasn't really, been so present in the infrastructure studies kind of scholarship that's come out. There was a big kind of handbook or guide to the infrastructural turn that had 34 chapters or something like this, and nothing on China, despite it having been called, I think quite accurately, the paradigmatic infrastructural state, right? A state produced by and through infrastructure as a modern project. So when most of us hear the word infrastructure, we think of pictures like this. We think of, highways and railroads and pipelines, tunnels and ports and so forth. But people who have traced its origins have shown how infrastructure started as a fairly narrow term and has become more and more kind of plastic in its range of meanings. So recently, some social scientists have theorized how urban residents themselves, like people, can become or can be productively thought of as infrastructure because their intersections with objects, practices, and with each other act as a platform that support life in the city. And so thinking of, again, infrastructures as things that kind of support other systems or that enable movement or what have you. Scholars have also argued that the ascent and the proliferation of infrastructure as a concept in use in social theory, in policy, and in mainstream discourse indexes a form of calculative reason, as well as a modernist desire to render social and environmental heterogeneity manageable and amenable to standardized solutions. So with that sort of growing plasticity or extensions of conceptualizations of infrastructure, it's not surprising that landscapes and nature itself has increasingly become understood as infrastructure. So like dams, bridges, airports, and wastewater treatment plants, wetlands, forests, and grasslands can also be made into objects of calculation and management that are aimed at allowing them or making them deliver services that are deemed useful for society, right? So in other words, they can be infrastructures. The term green infrastructure, which is kind of a synonym for natural infrastructure, was first introduced in the United States in the 1980s in the context of stormwater runoff management. Subsequently, green infrastructure and natural infrastructure were written, again in the US, into the Clean Water Act. It started to gain a lot of popularity in landscape architecture, land use planning, environmental design, and natural resource management, as you can see from some of these illustrations here. As as it started to grow in popularity, it also started to take on a much more expansive understanding beyond just sort of what to do with filtration and stormwater. So for example, Resources for the Future now defines green infrastructure projects as any project that, quote, relies on services produced by ecosystems. Another conservation think tank defines green infrastructure as, quote, the ecological framework for environmental, social, and economic health. In short, our natural life support system. So in other words, natural infrastructure has come to be seen more and more in terms of anything that can create or harness ecosystem services through design and implementation approaches. So the growing critical literature on infrastructural studies coming from geography and anthropology in particular treat infrastructures both as objects of study in and of themselves and simultaneously as an analytical lens onto a range of social phenomena. And that can include the state, governance, citizenship, corporate power, globalization, and whatnot. So it's that simultaneity of both infrastructure as object and infrastructure as analytical tool that I see as marking the difference between, for example, a natural resource management approach and an infrastructural approach to, or an infrastructure studies approach to natural infrastructure. So a resource manager might want to simply say, okay, this is a piece of green infrastructure. How, what are the biophysical characteristics and how can we calculate or improve the ecological services it provides? Whereas the latter sort of retains an interest in the material or biophysical characteristics, but also says we have to simultaneously pay attention to issues such as the political dimensions of how certain, how non-human nature gets mobilized in the service of supporting certain social activities or goals and not others, what sorts of calculation have to be applied to make this possible, how the resulting infrastructures are shaped by but may also exceed the intention of their designers, and how they differentially affect and are experienced by different groups of people. So when I say applying an infrastructural lens onto green infrastructure, this means asking, what does the treatment of green infrastructure say about state-society relationships? What might it tell us, for example, about ecological civilization? Excuse me. So natural infrastructure, right? Making natural infrastructure requires investments, and making investments requires calculative tools to justify those investments by revealing or by creating economic value, or at least by promising to lead to better policy solutions, right, towards those that are of greater value. And one of the most prominent calculative devices that has been developed and used for the making of natural infrastructure is known as INVEST, which is short for Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. INVEST is a creation of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford, and that operates as a partnership with a number of organizations, including the Nature Conservancy, WWF, the Resilience Center in Stockholm, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And it's really fundamentally premised on the idea that the world's ecosystems can be seen as capital assets. So what INVEST actually is a suite of open source, spatially explicit software models that quantify, map, and value ecosystem services, with the idea that decision makers can then use them to make decisions about trade-offs between different scenarios. According to one of its directors, Peter Cavera, who was a former chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, INVEST seeks to encourage governments to invest in natural infrastructure. So as he puts it, quote, governments build roads, governments build dams, governments build a lot of things. So why shouldn't governments invest in ecosystem services, the natural infrastructure, rather than the built infrastructure? So as a calculative tool to facilitate investments into the creation of natural infrastructure, INVEST works, as geographer Jessica Dempsey puts it, quote, as a political scientific strategy to translate ecological science into forms that create new interests in nature, right? And importantly, she says, at the same time, they work as tools for depoliticization, right? They render technical what are actually highly political interventions. And this is, I think, very well illustrated in an article, again, that Jack wrote a rebuttal letter to, and that I was also part of in 2016. But the article is a little clip of it is on the screen. It was published in Science in 2016, and it reports on the first national ecosystem assessment in China, which was conducted by the Chinese Ministry of the Environment and the Chinese Academy of Sciences using INVEST, right, and covering the years 2000 to 2010. One interesting thing about this is that the lead author, Ouyang Zhiyun is the director of the Research Center for Eco-Environmental Sciences of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the president of the Ecological Society of China. He's really a key figure in conservation policymaking in China. He is said to have had a profound influence on and broad applications to policymaking for ecosystem conservation, restoration, and land management from the local to national scales in China. In addition to being a top environmental scientist, he was also a student of both Wang Rusong and Ma Shijun, who Jesse Rodenbiker has recently published on. And those are two prominent Earth system scientists who were key figures in introducing system science approaches into sustainable development in China. And as Jesse argues, in making ecology developmental. In China. That is, where in some contexts, ecology is often sort of seen as a break-on or an argument against certain forms of capitalist development. These figures and their system science were kind of central in actually making ecology align with development within China. And arguably, this has direct implications into the ways in which ecological civilization today is a form of technocratic green modernization. So back to this article, they basically model biophysical data using INVEST, and they conclude that China's national conservation policies between 2000 and 2010, which include the Sloping Land Conversion Project, which Jack has written a lot about, the Natural Forest Protection Project, the Retire Livestock and Restore Grassland, and ecological migration, among others, have resulted in an overall increase in ecosystem services, right? And so they say, because of China's efforts along these lines, we have more food production, more carbon sequestration, more soil retention, flood mitigation, water retention, and sandstorm prevention. In fact, they say the only thing that has not improved is habitat, biodiversity habitat. So then the authors kind of make this classic ecological modernization argument, asserting that the modeling exercise shows that economic growth can coexist with the improvement of ecosystem services as long as there is, quote, intelligent policy design. And of course, what this does, and again, what many people have written about, is it renders technical and apolitical programs that have marginalized the people who are already the most marginalized in China. So if you look at the circle around, or the circle with the Roman numeral 3, that is the middle of the Sanjiangyuan area of Qinghai, the source of the Yangtze Yellow and Mekong rivers, where ecological migration has removed at least 50,000 Tibetan herders from pastoral livelihoods to these new and often poorly built settlements on the edges of distant cities. And you see an example of what that looks like on the right? And so there's been a lot of social dislocation, unemployment, declining living standards, and so forth. But again, the making of Sanjiangyuan as a natural infrastructure through this ecosystem service optimization effort obscures what are profoundly political consequences. And again, this was kind of the point of this letter to Science that Jack and a number of us wrote. Now, the reason I'm going on about this at length is because INVEST is not just a scholarly modeling exercise, right? It's being used actively by China's Ministry of Environmental Protection and the National Development and Reform Commission to create new natural infrastructures in the form of what are called national ecological functional zones. And a new, quote, national level ecological conservation red line planning process. And in fact, the authors claim that the results generated from this INVEST exercise have, quote, put 49.4% of China's land area into newly incorporated ecosystem function conservation areas. Indeed, the Natural Capital Project and INVEST have had much more success in China than in any other country globally in creating interests in green infrastructure. In her study of the rise of global biodiversity conservation, geographer Jessica Dempsey quotes one interviewee as reporting excitedly, quote, "China now has entire provinces designated as conservation provinces or development provinces, and they are basically targeting to development based on that planning. And then within every province, they have another plan that basically says where activities can be done, and it's all driven by biodiversity and ecosystem services." So on the one hand, it's absolutely true that certain provinces, and Qinghai in the Tibet Autonomous Region are kind of the primary examples of this, where they've really been designated as functioning primarily as providers of ecological services rather than as sites of industrial development. And this this creates all sorts of secondary effects on the ground. I know a woman who was having a sort of factory to have women produce like handmade soap, and that was not permitted on the grounds that this whole area, this whole area was supposed to be zoned for ecological production. At the same time, anyone who has spent any time in China knows that it's an exaggeration to think that production of ecosystem services is the only, or often even the primary result of policy, right? Or that ecological services are now the only political economic rationality for decision making at different scales. So this soap example is one place where it was used, but often other interests take over, and I'll get back to that point in my case studies. Nevertheless, it's also the case that the invest tool is more popular in China in actual policy or purported policy than elsewhere. So to quote Dempsey again, quote, "That the political scientific strategy of invest might be more effective in a decidedly illiberal state is worth noting," right? There are fewer interests to manage and negotiate among. So even before this invest-informed national ecosystem assessment, China had already become a global showcase for certain types of natural infrastructure, particularly through what's called its Sponge Cities program, which is an initiative for cities to lessen urban floods by using dispersed wetland and other green landscapes rather than traditional centralized stormwater drainage pipes. So this has been very rapidly disseminated throughout the country with a goal that all cities will become sponge cities. But I want to argue that in these new efforts to delimit and implement national ecological functional zones and ecological conservation red lines, also sometimes called ecological red lines, as you see here, natural infrastructure is being conceptualized at a much larger scale of the nation state. So, in the US with green infrastructure and with sponge cities, it's very much at the urban scale that's at work. But with this new emphasis on red lines, we really have a conceptual enframing of nothing short of the entire national territory, right, as an object of ecosystem service optimization. And here I'm drawing on Timothy Mitchell's use of enframing to refer to a method of dividing up space and containing, right? And it operates by conjuring up a sort of neutral surface or volume called space, right? Again, across the entire national territory. So one of the schemes, and there's lots of different forms of enframing. One of them, the major function-oriented zone planning, was introduced in the 11th five-year plan, and it divided all of China into 4 types of zones. This is separate from the national ecological function zones, and those are also separate from ecological conservation red lines. So the newest policy, red lines, is supposed to be declared in coordination with major function-oriented zones and also to encompass existing protected areas of various types. So they're supposed to coordinate between different designations and also act kind of like a red line of a minimum area. Though in fact, so far, trying to figure out what's actually going on the ground, it seems that they muddle the already very complicated panoply of existing and overlapping and sometimes conflicting designations. But why highlight these red lines? Well, they were written into China's newly revised environmental protection law in 2015. And in 2017, the party central committee and the state council issued a document declaring that the exact spatial boundaries of ecological red lines must be completed for all provinces by 2020. So in 2018, Sichuan province had established red lines accounting for about 30% of the area of the province. And you can see a little bit about that map of where those red lines are in the two clips from the document I've got here on the slide. And as of 2019, more than a quarter of China's land area has been earmarked to be in red lines. Government documents, academic articles by China-based scientists, and at least one article purportedly written by Xi Jinping himself in Choushi, which is, of course, the party's theoretical journal, makes clear that ecological red lines, along with ecological functional zones, are integral to the broader project of ecological civilization. So what exactly is ecological civilization, and how should we understand the natural infrastructure being created under its sign? I think many people here already know a lot about this, but as a sort of brief review, ecological civilization, 生态文明, was first introduced as an academic term by a Chinese agricultural economist in 1987. It really entered national discourse or national political discourse when Hu Jintao endorsed it in 2007, and of course it's been elevated to great prominence under Xi Jinping. It was enshrined in the CCP Constitution in 2012 and the Chinese Constitution in 2018. Under Xi, of course, it's frequently coupled with the China Dream, right? 中国梦. It's frequently coupled with the building of the new era of national rejuvenation and the idea of building a beautiful China. It's also very frequently addressed together with Xi Jinping's so-called two mountains theory, right? Which is on top here, which is that clear waters and green mountains are as valuable as gold and silver mountains. China scholars have called it, quote, an ideological framework for guiding the future of Chinese politics and society. It's been called a form of symbolic legitimation for the party state, a political framework, and a socio-technical imaginary. As with other civilizations that came before, right, spiritual, material, and socialist, it calls for the guidance and alteration of human behavior towards particular governmental ends. There are lively, if circumscribed, debates within China about what ecological civilization should actually mean, but most observers agree, at least from the outside, that it's really a statist ideology, right? That it draws on pretty selective and reductionist and actually contested interpretations of China's traditional philosophies, Taoism, Confucianism, while maintaining a long-standing focus on economic growth and on the need for scientific and technological solutions to ecological problems. It's also really replaced sustainable development. So in the 90s, 2000s, sustainable development was very popular as a term, and it's kind of been overshadowed by ecological civilization. What that does is it cynicizes environmentalism, right? It frees China from a trajectory of Western societies and allows China to position itself as a global leader. It's been marked, of course, by this decidedly authoritarian turn in China's environmental governance, characterized by military metaphors and campaign-style enforcement. What I want to point out is that, more concretely, the implementation of reforms aimed at achieving ecological civilization that began in 2015 have entailed centralization, bureaucratic mobilization, public supervision, a lot more ecological and environmental performance targets for officials. And importantly, it also kicked into gear a series of centrally organized environmental protection supervision and inspection teams, right, that started going from the center to the provinces in the name of ecological civilization to carry out campaign-style enforcement in multiple provinces, leading to the punishment of large numbers of officials. So by 2018, these ecological civilization inspection teams had reportedly punished more than 29,000 companies, 18,000 officials, and led to the detention of over 1,500 individuals. Along with punishment and of companies and detention of some officials, has come a tremendous amount of dismantling and destruction of existing built infrastructure. So some news reports provide examples such as the dismantling of 50% of Shandong province's chemical industrial parks, hotels, oil refineries, processing sites, golf courses, and also pig raising operations. So I think it's hard, I don't argue against the dismantling of illegal or environmentally destructive industrial and commercial operations. Again, like sitting here in the US, watching our environmental regulations being weakened, holding environmentally destructive corporations accountable sounds quite good. But not surprisingly, in China, these have not been the only targets of enforcement. So one example in 2016 is the banning of small-scale pig farming in most rural areas, leading to the forcible demolition of thousands of household pig farms. And as a result, a direct result, the further concentration of agribusiness capital, right, in the name of environmental protection. So we know that actually highly concentrated, factory farming is actually extremely environmentally damaging, but that's also what's been happening in the name of ecological civilization. In another case in Guangdong province, central level inspections targeted illegally constructed residential districts. Households that failed to move out within 3 days had their water and electricity cut off, which is we can think of as a form of infrastructural attack, as anthropologist Julie Chu has argued, right? Where infrastructure is used to force resettlement, right? This is a tactic that is frequently used across China in urban real estate development. And indeed, for several decades, the creation of new built infrastructure in China, in Chinese cities, has been predicated on the creation of an enormous amount of ruin, rubble, and waste, right? That's how real estate production has happened. And what I want to kind of argue is that, like the creation of built infrastructure, the creation of certain forms of abstract natural infrastructure also has been predicated on creating rubble and waste. And here I draw on anthropologist Gaston Gordillo's study of rubble, right, which he argues is a potent lens through which to, quote, examine space negatively by way of the places that were negated to create the geographies of the present. So what gets negated in this new round of creation of infrastructure, now natural infrastructure? He describes what David Harvey calls creative destruction of capitalism, but he calls it instead productive destruction, right? To emphasize the ways in which capitalism produces through processes of ruination, right? So to sort of not emphasize the sort of creative part, but the destructive part. And he also draws in Ann Stoller's concept of imperial disregard. That is the ways in which certain types of destruction can be affectively neutralized, right? Because there is a refusal to take notice, or an attitude of inattention, where the elite do not have to take regard for the destruction that underpins the creation of the new. So in theory, if we want to think about the destructive production of built infrastructure that takes place under the sign of ecological civilization, it's not a straightforward, it's not really well understood in the straightforward terms of conventional capitalist profit making in the way that it is for real estate. Instead, we could argue that the creation of natural infrastructure, of ecosystem services, is meant instead to maintain the conditions of possibility for the whole capitalist value creation process to continue at all. So while I was on sabbatical in Chengdu from 2018 to 2019, and I was involved in a small project that was supposed to be about post-earthquake livelihoods in Sichuan. And I stumbled upon what I'm currently thinking of as the destructive production of built infrastructure in the name of creating and improving natural infrastructure in the form of two scenic areas. And the destruction that I will talk about in my two case studies were directly associated with environmental inspections that were implemented as part of the Ecological Civilization campaign. But like other forms of destructive production, they also end up leading to profits for some and losses for others. So turning to the two case studies. The first case is from a village that I will call Summit Village as a clear pseudonym. It is in Wenchuan town, which is in Pengzhou, which is a county level city in Chengdu. So the map on the left shows this is not necessary for this audience, but Chengdu, and then where Pengzhou is on the northern tip of Chengdu. So the town is in the Longmenshan mountain range, which was near the epicenter of the 2008 Wenchuan earthquake. And the post-earthquake reconstruction plan, which was ratified within 3 months of the quake, called for tourism to be the pioneer industry throughout the earthquake zone. At the same time, the Longmenshan range has also been designated now as one of 2 ecological belts of the city of Chengdu. So the photo on the right is a picture I took from the Chengdu Planning Exhibition Hall. And you can see that Chengdu is now supposed to have 2 ecological belts, of which this is one. And they are supposed to have the primary function of conservation and ecotourism. In 2018, Chengdu also unveiled a new urban master plan that's encapsulated in the slogan, quote, extend to the east, expand to the south, control the west, upgrade the north, and optimize the center, which again is sort of this deepening of function orientation. And it specifically assigns the Longmenshan area to manifest Xi Jinping's 2 mountains theory of ecological civilization, right? The silver gold mountain theory. So Summit Village is a mountainous village in this town. Until the establishment of what I will call the Summit Mountain Scenic Area in 1986, the villagers were reliant on timber for their livelihoods. In 1989, the scenic area was promoted from a municipal level to a provincial level. Scenic area, and logging was restricted. So at that time, in 1989, the villagers became involved in tourism. They started opening nongjiale, or farm guest houses, for their livelihoods. This became even more important after Tuigen Huanling, or the sloping land conversion project, began in 2000, and that project led to the reforestation of about 90% of the village's farmland. So farming income very much was replaced by the operations of nongjiale. The area started to become really popular with retirees from Chengdu. It's called kind of the air conditioner of Chengdu, right? And people from Chengdu, or the sort of, more urbanized area of Chengdu and other cities would come spend several months here in the summer to escape from the heat. And so these evolved over time from rather simple and modest houses to very elaborate and expansive 2 to 3 floor buildings, which many villagers took on significant debts to build. By the time the earthquake struck, tourism constituted more than 80% of the household income in this village, and many villagers had taken on very substantial loans, which they had not yet paid back. Up until the earthquake, the Summit Mountain Scenic Area had been operated by the Pengzhou County Tourism Bureau, which sold the entrance tickets. Now, the Pengzhou County government had sought soon after the establishment of the provincial level scenic area to upgrade it to a national level scenic area, right? We see these kinds of moves all the time in Chinese tourism, again, something that Jack has written about, right? And so they tried to establish this national level scenic area with expanded boundaries and a new name, the Longmenshan National Scenic Area. The state council approved the application, but the provincial level departments never completed or submitted a master plan for approval as required by law, which led to a very ambiguous legal status for the scenic area, which becomes important later on. So in the photos here on the left, this is one hamlet in this village where a developer had sort of built these new houses right before the earthquake struck, and then they all got destroyed, and they had to move. These were not people don't live here anymore. And then the other photo is a photograph from lower down in this village. So the 2008 earthquake destroyed about 90% of the houses in the village. It also destroyed the two sites for which the scenic area had been most famous. Without those scenic sites or scenic spots, the county tourism bureau simply gave up. They abandoned the scenic area. They just, completely left. The villagers were left with no visitors and thus no incomes because they had become so dependent on these nongjialas. As a result, many residents spent the initial years after the quake undertaking labor migration. However, in 2012, a town leader encouraged the villagers to return to rebuild their houses and livelihoods. But the lack of income due to the absence of tourism remained an immense challenge. And these are just photos of some resettlement sites that have since been built for people who have not rebuilt their own houses. These are quite small compared to the nongjialas that have been rebuilt. So in 2014, the party secretary of the village mobilized members of the two highest altitude production teams, the ones closest to the scenic parts, to develop a new scenic spot. They found a picturesque spot, which they say was in their collective forest, which had not been affected by the earthquake or by subsequent debris flow, and which had not been in the boundaries of the provincial level Summit Mountain Scenic Area. This spot was in the boundaries of the national level scenic area, the Wenchuan Scenic Area, but village leaders very carefully studied the national regulations and determined it not to have legal status, given that a master plan had never been submitted and approved as required by law, nor had villagers signed on to the plan. The villagers, not very creatively, renamed the spot Wolonggu and developed it for tourism. So they registered a new company. 300 village households invested in it with more than 10 million renminbi of registered capital. And the village company built a new road to this newly opened scenic spots. They built paths, pavilions, toilets, and a wastewater treatment facility, as well as hiring 30 villagers as employees. The village company was, again, quite careful to not sell tickets because that could have provoked some legal question. Instead, they charged a 10 renminbi parking fee per vehicle and a cleaning fee per person. Now, this quickly became wildly popular. It drew tens of thousands of visitors every day, including many who came once more to stay in the rebuilt nongjialas. So from 2015 to 2017, there were reportedly about 700,000 visitors per year in the village, bringing 4 to 6 million renminbi to the village, right? Not including the income brought to individual households with nongjialas. And this, again, prompted people to start to reinvest. And the Pengzhou city government at the time appeared to be very supportive of their efforts. On a number of occasions, deputy mayors and the party secretary visited, and I found a number of newspaper articles where they fully affirmed the construction of the scenic spots and sort of held up this village as a model for others. Now, all of this changed very abruptly. On August 20th, 2017, the Pengzhou government declared the operation illegal, shut it down, posted security guards to block further entrance, and you can see a notice of shut down, and then you can see the gate there. So not only were the pavilions and pathways, but the toilet facilities were also dismantled. This sudden about-face of the municipal government in its stance on Wolonggu was the result of the Central Fifth Environmental Inspection Group, which conducted its investigations in Sichuan province for a month, starting August 7th, 2017, filing 8,966 reports of environmental problems, including Wolonggu, on the grounds of illegal construction. With the closure of the scenic spot, the village company's earnings dropped to zero and household income decreased by 70 to 80% as guests once again didn't come to stay at their nongjiala, right, with no scenic spot to visit. However, and here's where, what happens on the ground gets quite complicated, and there's more going on than the production of natural infrastructure. The shutdown of Wolonggu did not end plans for tourism. Instead, the Pengzhou government turned the management of this scenic spot over to a state-owned company of the Pengzhou Municipality Tourism Bureau. The village had invested over $500,000 in a wastewater treatment plant capable of treating about 50 tons of water per hour, and the county tourism company simply took it over with no compensation to the villagers. So villagers, not surprisingly, interpret this as clear evidence that the reason for the shutdown was not environmental protection and the production of ecological values, but rather that the government had become jealous of their success in raising money and wanted those profits for the government instead. That is, in this case, rather than qualitatively new forms of natural infrastructure in the sense of providing new ecological services as an abstract infrastructure of state building, the Central Environmental Inspection Team instead provided an opportunity for the local state to appropriate villagers' own income generation through a scenic area form, right, as a sort of minimally built infrastructure as a commercial venue. A similar set of dynamics have also shaped Caoping village in Wenchuan County in Aba Prefecture, which is just west of Chengdu Municipality. This village is the site of the Panda Scenic Spot, which was first established in 1999 by an investor from Chengdu. So this scenic spot also was located in the upper forested area of the village on the boundary of the buffer and core zones of the Wolong Nature Reserve. The Wolong Nature Reserve had, of course, first been established in 1963 and was expanded in 1975. And the 1975 expansion incorporated collective forests that had previously only been under the management of the village. Like many villages in this area, including the previous one, this village largely relied on agriculture until the implementation of Tuigenhuanling, or the sloping land conversion project, which resulted in more than 3/4 of the household farmland being planted by trees, leaving families with an average of about 0.7 mu of farmland per household. So fortunately for the households in this village, right when the sloping land conversion project was implemented, this investor came in and started to establish the Panda Scenic Spot. So given its location on the boundary of the buffer and core zone, where construction in the Wolong Nature Reserve was not actually supposed to be allowed, the construction of the scenic spot by this investor had to require special permission from the Provincial Forestry Department. And indeed, the Provincial Forestry Department in 1909 issued a special memorandum allowing the investor to construct the scenic area, which included several hotels, and the scenic area featured horse rides, rafting, zip lines, camping, a little mini train ride for 3 kilometers, and hiking opportunities. The construction of the scenic spot also brought a well-paved road to the village, which you can see in this picture. And so villagers started to, take up income-earning opportunities, such as carrying, tourists up on wooden sedans, carrying packs for rafters, guiding horses, and running barbecues. And as with many other places, villagers also began to turn their houses into nongjiale for the tourists visiting the scenic area. Now, despite its proximity to the earthquake epicenter, the village was not very severely affected, and the main hotel of the scenic area actually stood in place after the quake. Nevertheless, as part of the recovery effort, the county purchased the scenic spot from the investor and spent significant funds on its reconstruction. Also, as part of this whole suite of post-earthquake measures, the National Tourism Administration gave the title of Quintuple A Special Tourist Attractions, right, 5 A's, to a number of sites in Wenchuan, including this one, right? And this is supposed to indicate China's most important and best maintained attractions. So after the earthquake, this county government enterprise started to operate this Panda Scenic Area as part of this nationally recognized, Quintuple A site. And this is an official map from that time. And on this map, the scenic spot is described as, quote, an important part of the Wolong National Nature Reserve. So it's actually seen as part of the nature protection. And as of 2017, 77 out of 101 households in the villages were operating nongjiale. However, in 2017, the scenic spot was abruptly closed as a result of environmental inspections due to its location on the border of the buffer and core zones of the Wolong National Nature Reserve, where such construction and commercial activity were never supposed to be permitted. And if you see this hotel, it's pretty outrageously large. It has a very big footprint, right? And so it was the Provincial Forestry Department that had allowed this in 1999. Of course, when it was closed down in 2017, the Provincial Forestry Department was never held accountable for having given permission for this. All of the built infrastructure in the scenic spot, except for this hotel, which was deemed too large to actually move without causing even more damage, was dismantled and removed. So all the train tracks and the other hotels and zip lines and whatnot. The abrupt closure and dismantling of the scenic spot was quite shocking to the villagers. They described it as having happened overnight. According to one village leader, he said, many cried when they heard the news because they realized they had no way to recover the loans that they had taken out to build and expand their nongjiale. And so village income fell by more than half right away. Now, this closure of the scenic site coincided with the end of the 2 phases of subsidies for the sloping land conversion project and was followed almost immediately by the village leaders' discovery that their entire village had been slated for inclusion into the newly declared Giant Panda National Park, right, which is supposed to span Sichuan, Gansu, and Shanxi provinces and cover an area triple the size of the US's Yellowstone National Park. Now, at the time of this surprise discovery, the village leaders had been in the process of negotiating with a company for rafting operations outside of the core and the buffer areas of the Wolong Nature Reserve in a bid to try to bring tourists to the village again in the wake of the scenic spot closure. And they had reached an agreement with a company to develop a new rafting operation to bring tourists back to their nongjiale, their farm guest houses. But as they planned to move forward, the county government informed them that, at least as of 2019, and I don't think it's changed since then, rafting would not be allowed inside the national park. And they also talked about how, they were brought to a meeting and basically told, sign this paper that says you are in the park. And, whether you sign it or not is not going to make any difference about whether your village is in the park, so you better sign it, because you'll just make trouble for yourself if you don't. Now, unusually, the village leaders here, unlike in many, many parts of China, don't blame local officials, but rather Xi Jinping himself, right, along with his ecological civilization drive and his two-mountain theory, which they particularly call out for, in their words, making peasants the last of the last in China today. So to wrap up, as the U.S. withdraws ever more completely, though hopefully not permanently, from all forms of global environmental cooperation, never mind leadership, it's hardly surprising that China's ecological civilization model of authoritarian green development has gained considerable traction. Ecological civilization is now regularly touted in the pages of prestigious scientific journals, as well as the halls of the United Nations, as a model for other countries to emulate. And indeed, from my personal perspective, in comparison with the Trump regime's denial of climate science, the attention to the production of natural infrastructure to create ecosystem services has much to recommend it. It is hard to argue against the shutting down of illegal oil refineries or the enforcement even of longstanding restrictions on building inside nature reserves for panda habitat. At the same time, however, the cases of the 2 villages in Pengzhou and Wenchuan, Sichuan, are cautionary tales and not at all exceptional ones about what gets turned into rubble in the name of ecological civilization, right? In post-earthquake Sichuan, what we see is a shift in the state's interest from the production of built infrastructure to support livelihoods after the disaster to, not very many years later, sort of forgetting about that and turning to the destruction of most built infrastructure, except for the ones that the local state wants to expropriate for itself, right, for the production of an abstract natural infrastructure. So unfortunately, the demolition of built infrastructure that occurs in the process of setting aside zones for ecosystem services, right, whether scenic areas, ecological functional zones, or red lines, end up serving the interests of centralized state power and the urban consuming classes, while the resulting rubble and the concomitant deprivation of access to peasants' livelihood resources are the subject of what Stoller calls imperial disregard. There's a refusal to regard them in the pursuit of ecological civilization. At the same time, however, it's clear that the intention to set aside ecological red lines does not mean that China has seamlessly become an idealized ecological state. Local political economic interests, as always, allow powerful actors to simply expropriate entrepreneurial, ecological, and aesthetic resources from villagers, in some cases without any material or changes in the material or biophysical characteristics or qualities of the landscape. So returning to the question of the infrastructural turn, what I've argued is that using infrastructure as an analytic can help focus our attention on the socio-political relations around the concept of natural infrastructure that has otherwise been rendered technical. And finally, thinking about the ways in which, as many have argued, different types of infrastructure are associated with different temporalities, I suggest that in ecological civilization, the infrastructural time of the village, right, with its sort of slow accretion, the destruction from the earthquake, and then the slow accretion once more, has really been displaced by a national scale infrastructural time, which is a developmentalist, linear, smooth temporality that's oriented towards a statist future. So that is all from my presentation. I'm going to unshare my screen and see if we can have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Emily. So now for the Q&A, if you move your mouse around, you'll see down at the bottom of the Zoom screen a Q&A icon. Please enter your questions into that, and Professor Ye will be taking her own questions for the next, however long we have questions.
I suppose since there aren't, I don't know who's allowed to talk and who's not. You could either type them in, or if hand raising works, that works too, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, there's a hand up from Juliet.
I don't see Juliet on my screen. It's very strange. But
Oh.
I'll ask a question. Oh, Juliet.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, me first. Thank you, Kristen Stapleton, University of Buffalo. It was a really interesting talk. I have to admit, I signed up because of the original description, because I was really curious to hear how you were going to explain this Chinese government's great commitment to this. And but I'm not sure how that description got into your talk, but I was really glad I came anyway. And my question is, so in very packed Chinese cities, like with the Xinjiang and stuff, there's an argument for getting rid of them based on health, based on quality of life, that sort of thing. And I'm kind of curious if you see that, what are the significant differences between this kind of infrastructural development based on environmental justifications versus quality of life versus safety, those justifications. Thank you.
That's a really good question. I haven't myself done much on the Xinjiang, so I think it matters a lot whether I think the two things that are involved here that may not be involved there are a loss of access to livelihoods. And in some cases, not so much the ones I talked about here in particular, but you can definitely see them in other places, kind of a physical resettlement. So I'm not sure if the redevelopment that you're talking about is of the type where they're actually moving people, or just, I know there's a move to urban regeneration, kind of urban renewal as well, which I think is slightly different. And I'm not, is that more along what you're talking about? Or is it more, we need these people to sort of stay in this place, but live in different kinds of buildings?
Well, I think both happens, but there definitely is relocation for a reason, for justification being for quality of life. Like, the Shanghai Gone, Qin Xiao's book about the destruction of, but I think it also happens that some people are able to stay. And I think that's more likely down in southern Chinese cities where the village has a stronger corporate identity and more legal clout.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's all sorts of resettlement and concentration and removal and consolidation happening everywhere. I do think I do think like a lot of what happens in Shenzhen, there is a lot more village. Yeah, there's village corporations that have much more strength than in the case of Sichuan. The other thing that I see a lot in areas around these villages, but not in these particular villages, is consolidation for, the idea of not wasting land. And that's ultimately driven by kind of environmental logic too, right? It's like we're running out of farmland, so we have to have a red line. And so, but you can trade. And so in order to create that more farmland, you take the ZIGD of everyone and you can turn that into farmland, right? So there is this sort of, red line for farmland that has a somewhat environmental argument to it too. Yeah, I mean, in these cases, in these particular cases of scenic areas, there's not much justification going on other than environmental, and that, there's no arguments being made about health or even much development. That's again different from like in the Tibetan resettlement case, where there's also this idea that people need to be removed so that the grasslands can perform their ecological services better. And there's a sort of layered, like, well, this is good for these backwards people who wander around with their livestock, and by putting them into these urban settlements, they'll become more developed. In these particular cases, so I think the drive to ecological services can intersect with all these other kinds of rationales. In these particular cases around Chengdu, it was really, really just, ecological civilization means we have to do these things, and therefore these activities that have been going on so far are not acceptable anymore. I think I lost the thread of your question. So if I didn't answer it very well, please.
No, thank you. That's great.
Restate it. Juliet had something. Sorry, Juliet.
Yeah, no,
that's twice now.
No, my Zoom shut down and then opened again, I think when the speaker or when everything was switched over. And I just wanted to flag for also the person that is for Amala who's organizing that. I don't think it's possible now to add open questions. So if people start generating questions, I don't know if they can add them, but maybe it's just me. But my question was that I think that in analyses, especially of China's environmental approaches, there's some cynicism, and I think it's correct cynicism, that everything is about power, everything is about state power versus certain individual actors' ability to profit. And that's your story lends to that in a way that I think is nuanced and well argued. But are there ways in which culture, ecological civilization, and specifically, the fact that villagers can get together and formulate their own idea. For me, what was so interesting about the story is that it's cases of villages coming together and themselves kind of defining how the place that they live in is ecological or is attractive and scenic. And do you see like kind of cultural attitudes shifting along with kind of the scramble to make money and to garner political power through this bigger strategy of ecological civilization? Or is it just cynically kind of money and politics?
That's a great question. I do see a lot of people who buy into ecological civilization, and I think there have been some surveys, about the term ecological civilization as well, where urban residents and some rural villagers do kind of align with various parts of it. I think the idea that there needs to be environmental protection is actually quite well accepted, and more accepted than here. You know what I mean? And then like with Tibetans, again, who I know better than these, I've done a lot more with them than with these villagers near Chengdu. Although I agree with you, these people were very proactive about learning the law and articulating like what was beautiful about their own place. So I think that kind of bottom-up agency happens a lot. I think, the people I'm familiar with more in Tibetan rural areas are also very active in thinking about the need for some sort of ecological future, right? But and working pretty hard to try to align their ways of being and their idea of what a beautiful cultural landscape is with the state's discourse of ecological civilization, to sort of use it agentively. I think I'm also just like attracted to discontent or something, because I a lot of these two villages in particular, people were really upset. Like they were really mad about what was happening to them. So they saw ecological civilization quite cynically as a state project, but that didn't mean that they weren't in some cases, in some ways proud of the fact that there are wild animals, right, that live near to where they live. So I think there's both going on. I think, yeah, just that the way the past few years have gotten much more authoritarian has not helped these rural places. I do think a lot of urban residents are quite on board with ecological civilization.
Could I just say something? I'm glad to see that more people are showing up. I think we have a small enough group that if you wish to turn on your video, it's probably fine. And also, as Juliet noted, it seems like the Q&A function isn't actually operating. So the raise hand function, or raising the hand on your screen, is probably a great idea. And I see, Magnus, you have your hand up, so we'll let you take off.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I was very curious about the historical looking back that you also gave us a little bit about. And I was curious about how the people who invented this term, ecological civilization, you mentioned that it has supplanted the term sustainable development. I think you mentioned that was because it's a nativization. This ecological civilization is a Chinese invented term, so it allows for staking something out that's not connected to somebody else's concept, if I understood it correctly. And so I'm curious about how the people who came up with this term and the politicians, the political figures who use it, how they reconcile this notion with the devastation, environmental devastation that's been going on for centuries and centuries in China. I mean, the massive deforestation, all of that, which doesn't go well with this idea, I understand, as being part of this, that China was always ecological and always an ecological civilization. I'm curious if you can say something about how this environmental history of China is talked about, how that's talked about by these proponents of Chinese ecological civilization. I want to add as a footnote that I'm asking also because I had this strange experience. A couple of years ago, I hosted a Chinese visiting scholar who was very keen on trying to write for American journals to sort of augment his publication record. And he showed me, he wrote up a manuscript which was about ecological civilization. And that was the first time I had ever heard of this term. I had never come across this before. And it was a little bit out of the blue for me because I tried to ask this scholar, can you define it a little more? And he had great trouble defining it. Later I realized that this is something that's always an edict coming from above, and it lands in the lap of academics, and then they have to go and write papers about it. And probably that's what happened to my friend, that he felt obliged to write on this topic. And he had actually not been thinking very much about what it really would mean. And he also was struggling with this problem of how to reconcile the pretty horrific environmental history that's part of Chinese history with this notion of China somehow being naturally an ecological civilization.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know, and I would love to hear actually what other people, I know Jack has written about ecological civilization as well. My understanding is that the people who champion it, and now it's become such a political term, right? They don't acknowledge that, you know, what Mark Elvin calls the 3,000 years of lack of sustainability, right? They very much selectively look back at certain things from Confucius and from Taoism and say, you know, look at that. That shows that we've always been aligned with this. I mean, I think certain elements of the recent socialist past are just sort of said, well, those were mistakes, right? But we've gotten over it. Yeah, I don't really have a great answer for that because I don't see a lot of substance in it. I mean, I think some of the earlier writings are sort of maybe arguing for an ecological civilization rather than necessarily just asserting that we're always already ecological, but rather this is something that we need to do. And so that's kind of also the civilizational aspect of it. We need to make people behave in certain ways guided by the party, right? That will make us ecological. And we can look back at these antecedents. But I think when it becomes a sort of, we were always like this, it's really a sort of nationalist China on the global stage, you know, China as a global leader move rather than any serious look at environmental history. But again, I'd love to hear what other people think of that, or whether anyone has encountered anything more critical, because I haven't. Jack, have you?
From within China, no. Yeah. I mean, I think like one thing, I guess just the one thing that I'd add to that is that, I mean, there is a, right, like they sort of like retake a certain version of Marxian historiography and say there was primitive civilization, agricultural civilization, industrial civilization, and now we have ecological civilization. And industrial civilization was environmentally disastrous, and it was because of that linear teleological advance. And so they can say that, you know, like, yes, we had to pollute first and clean up later, but now we're in the business of cleaning up.
Yeah, so I think you're right. It does. There's a stage, right? And Jesse's work shows this. But there's also this, like, you know, very Chinese national pride. Look, we can point back to our ancient philosophies to support what we're doing now. So it's a little bit of both of those.
Yeah. Well, and and there's a clear contradiction where the historian, like the teleological approach says that this is a universal and necessary project, but at the same time, there's all this stuff saying that this is China's national destiny and it can only happen in China because of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and other kinds of things. And it's also just a rubric for all the policies that happen to already be coming through. I will stop there. This is not my show.
Thank you. Martin.
We've got a hand up from Renhuang Paul Chong.
Okay, I can only see half the hand, so I know Martin had one and then someone else had one. So whoever wants to go first.
Who is on first? Well, I'll say my quick question, and that is, I'm 78 now. I'm a senior scholar. I guess I grew up in a time when there's lots of discussion of population growth and the need to get a sustainable level of population, and in fact undeveloped population. And I'm just curious as to whether in ecological the human being is in any way, the number of human beings is in any way thought of as a portion of the ecological equation that has to be considered. I know in the initial books on ecology, that's a clear area of discussion. And
You mean in China or in general?
I mean in China, because if they're using the word ecology and ecological, they've got to consider the effects of, I don't mean just industrial change and pollution, but that's clearly an issue, but simply the pressure of growth in population on and the number of people. Some people have talked about that in terms of urban versus rural. Some people have talked, I guess you've made some reference to it when you talk about the decrease in farmland. And therefore the need to consider crop production and food production, things of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a couple things. I think,
by the way.
I mean, so China has, of course, had a one-child policy for a very long time, but somewhat ironically, right now, it's really trying to encourage people to, they've loosened that because they have a real demographic crisis, right? In terms of there's not going to be enough laborers to support all of the retired people because of so many years of a pretty drastic one-child policy. And so, strict population control is not part of ecological civilization because of this demographic economic crisis. I guess I would also say from, stepping back from just China that, many scholars have pointed to not population numbers, but consumption as sort of being, right, the more at the root of our ecological crises, that it is the disproportionate overconsumption of certain parts of the world population, and not so much, the problem is over there with those, developing countries that have too many people, right? That's a pretty problematic framing. But I think China's approach right now is that they're going full steam ahead for consumption, right? Except they are doing something about climate change. We can talk about some problems with that, but population control right now is not a big issue because of the unintended effects of many decades. And also just in terms of the urbanization issue, a lot of the urbanization is happening because of real estate, right? It's happening because in the current stage of capitalism, a lot of economic growth is being driven by urbanization, and many governments rely on the revenue from real estate development for their continued operation. And so that is happening, and that pushes against ecological civilization too, right? So there's all these ways in which we have a set of ideals of ecological civilization, and then the political economic realities of capitalist accumulation kind of get in the way of that. Another good example of that is just with climate change, where again, China has a much better plan than the US, clearly. At least China's paying attention to climate change. On the other hand, even as it's investing in a lot of renewable energies, it's also building coal-fired power plants like mad, right? There's already an overcapacity of coal-fired power plants, and they keep adding and adding and adding them, as well as funding them overseas. Why? Because they would be in a severe because of overaccumulation of capital, and that capital needs somewhere to go, right? And so those things are happening at the same time as ecological civilization is coming in, and they don't always align. In fact, they often don't align.
Okay, Nick. Oh, sorry.
Someone else had their hands up, and I don't know.
Yeah, so we have Ren Huanghuo Cheng, and then
Yeah.
Lourdes Casanova, and then Xin Xu.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, the concept of ecological civilization. Do you see it being, say, like, adopted by governments in Southeast Asia? And how is this concept of ecological civilization like also framed in the context of the Belt and Road initiatives?
That's a really fantastic question. I know I've seen a lot of increasingly like publications in Science and Nature, right, where Chinese scientists are saying ecological civilization, it's not just for China. China can lead the world in this. I see it a lot in the idea of the Green Belt and Road. I don't know. It would be great if someone like Julia or others know whether it's been taken up by those governments. That I don't know, but I think it certainly has that potential because it's been championed so much. And again, like the UN has very much championed it, but I don't know about specific countries. There's also, along with the taking up of the Belt and Road, I think there's also some growing skepticism, right? There's like the attraction of the Belt and Road, and then there's also certainly civil society awareness of some of its drawbacks too.
Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone knows if there's specific countries that have taken it up, I'd be okay. Juliet says, I hear Green Belt and Road, but not ecological civilization. Maybe the civilization is a little too much for people, right? It's a very, it's a very Chinese kind of term, right? You had spiritual civilization, you had socialist civilization, right? So it has certain cultural resonances that may not play very well in other places.
Okay.
I think you're next. I can't hear.
Are you frozen? It looks like Lourdes Casanova may be freezing up.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Oh,
Okay.
We can hear you now. If you could hear me, could you please ask your question? Oh, it looks like we just lost her. Then I guess Xin Xu, could you ask? And hopefully we'll have that asker reappear.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. I have, originally one question, but I was also struck by the term or the comment on basically the concept of ecological civilization. Well, in Chinese, definitely it's 生态文明, right? But the Chinese official translation, and the English translation of this phrase, actually is not civilization, it's ecological advancement or ecological progress. I found that, quite interesting. I don't know if you have any, insight on that. But my main question is really about the role of state, particularly the change dynamics of the central-local governmental relations against the backdrop of Xi Jinping's centralization of power, right? So, I mean, this is basically, as we all know, it's really very critical when it comes to the environmental protection or sustainable development or ecological civilization, whatever you call it. I mean, how you really implement the policies, made, right? But before Xi Jinping, I mean, for political scientists, they usually, they look at Chinese political system and still think this is authoritarian, but they developed so-called fragmented authoritarianism framework to make sense of the increasingly pluralistic policy process in which there's other actors, right? Even, some are state or others from civil society or from society, and then they enter the policy process as so-called policy entrepreneurs to shape or to, compete to shape the policy. Well, with Xi Jinping's re-centralization effort, I think you kind of touch upon the change relationship between the central and the local governments, right? Particularly your case studies. I mean, the last case, to the very end, you said, I mean, the villagers basically, they don't blame their local government, but Xi Jinping, right? So my question is really, I think this is quite interesting because on the one hand, when the authoritarian framework was really fragmented to the extent that the local leaders may do whatever they like, ignoring even the very serious policy, national policy. But now, with the more relentlessly implemented centralized control, perhaps we have to do whatever Xi Jinping or the central government want them to do. But I wonder, it's still a space here for the local government to negotiate for their local interests. Or there's ways they may, on the one hand, pretend to do whatever they have to, or do whatever they have to do anyway. On the other, still try their best to play their role to suit the local conditions, particularly the kind of, I think, the vested interest between the local leaders or local or politicians and maybe the development, the capitalists or the interest groups, as well as the local people. So, or basically, no, it's simply just always, I mean, the top-down kind of story. Xi Jinping is like an emperor, I mean, can control, and then everyone had to do this. There's very little room for not only, I mean, we are not talking about civil society, but here, just local government. So that's my main question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great and complicated question. I don't think. So first, I was very surprised when these people, this village party secretary, actually went straight for Xi Jinping and said, it's his fault. Like, I have never heard that before. I've always heard, Xi Jinping is great, but it's the local leaders, right? The more typical story. So I was very surprised to hear that. I don't think all space for maneuver for local governments has gone away. I think it's still there. I just think it's less than it was before, right? I think that yeah, I mean, the space for negotiation has undoubtedly shrunk. This kind of campaign style implementation where they don't trust the province to do the job, right? They have to take people from the center and go to these places is an indication of, this, Xi Jinping wanting to be the emperor or whatever. That said, China has had a negotiated, fragmented authoritarian system for a very long time. I don't think that has disappeared. I just think it has, another example, and of course there's all different levels of local, right? And so there's all different levels of politics at play. But one really interesting thing I heard about this Panda National Park, which was difficult to dig too much into, but I had heard that the provinces were sort of told, you're going to get, all the provinces thought that they had some subsidies coming to them. And so they tried to play the system when they were asked by the central government, well, how many mu or hectares of land should be in this park, right? And so they all, trying to play the system as they always did, over-reported or reported a large number, and then they were told, well, you're not going to get any subsidies, but you have to implement it. Right? So then they were really very upset. And there's a lot of, I think, tension between Sichuan province and the center around the Panda National Park. So I don't think the fact that they were kind of trying to strategize to give a large number to get more subsidies shows that there's agency. The fact that, the center is trying to not pay them shows some tension. I don't know how that's going to play out in the end. Yeah, so I think both of those things are happening. There's this like increasing authoritarianism, and negotiation is not dead, right? It would be hard to imagine that happening completely.
Thank you so much. What's your sense of the Chinese official translation?
Excuse me.
Sorry. Yeah, John, let me actually answer that. I have seen Ecological Civilization a lot in English, so I'm quite curious that it's not translated that way. I wonder if some people are starting to translate it as something else because they realize, that it has certain connotations in English that may not match very well. But I have certainly seen Ecological Civilization in some official documents too. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, my apologies for the interruption. So we were past 6 o'clock, but Professor Ye has kindly offered to stay in to finish just a couple more questions. We have 2 hands already up. Please be economical in asking your questions, and thanks everybody.
Yeah. Hi. So my name is Lourdes Casanova, and I'm from the School of Management. My question. So one question and one comment. First, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I was not aware that China was developing and at the same time to remain ecological, which usually doesn't happen. Most countries, while they develop, they cause tremendous environmental damage. And then my question is, if you could comment on GEIDCO, GEIDCO, that's the project of the World Wide Web, so the electricity World Wide Web. So the idea is that state grid would connect the electricity grids of all over the world with the intention to manage the solar panels and the wind farms and coal and electricity and nuclear and hydroelectrical dams. So could you please comment on that? Because definitely it's a major project for the world, and it's already happening. So they are already connecting Mongolia, Russia, Cambodia, and others.
Yeah, so to the first point, I guess I just want to clarify a little bit that, for a long time, China's stance was we're developing, so we're not going to take care of the environment. That's a Western capitalist bourgeois thing, right? That from the 1970s until later on, for a couple decades. Now China very much is taking on the mantle of global leadership in environmental protection. So that's what Ecological Civilization is all about. That's not to say that there's not still an awful lot of really terrible environmental problems happening, both in terms of industrial pollution and other types of environmental problems, and also that many of China's environmental solutions really cause further problems. I have to apologize. I really don't know anything about GEIDCO, so pardon my ignorance. I want to say one thing about, the grid is, it's highly political in China, at least. And certainly what you have right now is a lot of renewable energies that are being developed, but not connected to the grid. or they are connected to the grid, but they are severely curtailed because coal-fired power plants, they are privileged in terms of being allowed to generate a certain amount of electricity. There is an oversupply of electricity. So there's lots and lots of energy, both coal-fired and renewable, being produced in China right now that is simply not even used, right? So again, there's a big kind of political economy question there. But I don't know anything about JICA, and I apologize for that. There was one more?
And last we have Connie Yuan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
First, thank you. It was a really interesting talk. And to me, the question is like, I think China is really has a unique history and also develop really fast. So a lot of, I think the UK is like I can understand the villagers, they were upset, but it seems to me they didn't follow the law, the rule to begin with, right? So they try to play the game, I think, so I'm just trying to step back. If in something in the US, like Ithaca, we decide to, the local people decide to, benefit from the waterfalls locally, and we start something without what will happen. And the other thing, I think the tension between the local government and the state government, that has been there almost all the time, but I think it's more, how can I say? So because I was involved in that project about coal to gas switch, and we did a survey about the Chinese people. I think you mentioned they blame local government, but not the central government. It seems the tension is always there. But then I think about to what extent when we interpret the results from China, we have to take into consideration, the unique Chinese history. Things are changing so fast, and what happened on the ground is actually outpaces the rule, laid out by the government, and also, the tension between their different layers of authority, and that's actually to me is universal. So, for example, tension between the U.S. state versus central government, or even at Cornell, department, college, and university level, each layer has its own interest. The tension, so sometimes I feel like the tension, you observe in China, it can be, anywhere. So,
yeah, so thank you for that question. I have two comments to it. One, so in these two cases, right, it's not the villagers who didn't follow the rules, it's the county government. So in the first place, the county government wanted to make it a national level scenic area, but they never followed through on their legal obligations. So they didn't have a plan, they didn't do any village consultation, but they insisted that something that is actually legally not clear or really not viable from the point of view from the law was in place. In the second case, it was the county forest, the provincial forestry bureau that gave an investor, a businessman, permission to build. Right. So in both cases, it is not villagers who didn't follow the rules. It is actually the government. But the government or the provincial forestry bureau are not held accountable. It's the villagers who are held accountable. Right. So that's kind of what I'm pointing out to. And yeah, like there's conflicts everywhere. There's tensions everywhere. I don't think villagers always do the right thing from the point of view of the environment. What I'm trying to step back and say is that certain actors end up being held into account, and certain priorities, in this case, a sort of national developmentalist vision, takes priority over a village sense of time and justice, right? So that ultimately what ends up happening aligns with a sort of statist view, not with the village view. From a more abstract infrastructural perspective. And I just think, yeah, so I'm not trying to say villagers are environmental angels or they always do something from an abstract right point of view, but who gets held to what standards, right, and with what effects, and who benefits from that is kind of what I'm trying to point out.
Wow, thank you everybody for such wonderful questions, and to Emily, for such a wonderful presentation and answers. We do have another presentation by Bin Xu coming up next week on Sent Down Youth and their memories of the Maoist era. And we hope to see you all there.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the questions. I really, they were very thought-provoking, and I'll keep thinking about them going forward. So thanks so much for this opportunity.